Hello, everybody. I'm Nigel Prince. I'm the director of Artist Mundi. I'm a middle-aged man with a shaved head, a bit of a grey grizzly beard, clear frame spectacles, a black crew neck sweater, and sitting against a pale grey background. Welcome to the first of At the Table talks. That sits alongside the exhibition or as part of the bigger project, AM10. The At the Table talks for this edition are in partnership with British Council Wales, and we give very sincere and genuine thanks to them for their great support in this partnership. The first talk is with artist Nguyễn Trinh Thi, whose installation And They Die a Natural Death is showing at Glyn Vivian Art Gallery in Swansea. That's going to form the basis for the panel discussion today. For those of you who need assistance, we have Paul and Nikki, BSL, who will be on screen. And for those who need other kinds of assistance, captioning, there is a button on the menu bar at the bottom of the screen that you can enable, and Maria is available for that. So thanks to all of you for attending, wherever you are in the world. And just to also say a bit of housekeeping, if your link drops down for any reason at all, just log back in and you'll be able to rejoin the panel discussion. So for now, I'll vanish from your screen and I'll hand over to Zoe Butt, who will be introducing the panelists, and you'll see a short clip of T's installation. Thanks, and look forward very much to the talk, everybody.
Good afternoon, good evening. My name is Zoe Butt, and I'm sitting in my office in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand against a white background, wearing black glasses and a black and white shirt with some red stripes. It's an honor to be in the room today with some cherished friends, minds, thinkers. Indeed, Nguyễn Trinh Thi, the artist of the evening, is one of my first artists in Vietnam that really got me thinking about what it means to commit to a place like Vietnam, where I had the wonder of living for nearly 15 years. But today, we're here because of Artist Mundi 10 and the significant installation work that is showing of Nguyễn Trinh Thi, one of the finalists at Glyn Vivian Gallery. I want to begin by, as a curator and a writer, sharing a little bit of a description of my own experience of the work. So thank you to Letty for putting a still image up of the work, if you can. So imagine that you have arrived in Cardiff and you're going to take the train to Swansea, which is about a little over an hour. And you get out of the train and you walk down to this marvelous gallery space, just a very short walk from the station. And you enter what seems to be a little kind of corridor. There are a lot of plants that are sitting outside. Not quite sure what kind of plants these are. And you're instructed to walk into a room where it's titled on the outside, And They Die Another Death. And you open these doors into a very dark room. So it takes some time for your eyes to adjust. And slowly you start to see that there's a kind of walkway. It's an enclosed walkway, and you're encouraged to walk into it. And it's an unusual shape. And you realize that you're standing in the middle of a room in a kind of, it's like a kind of a walkway over something. You're not quite sure how deep this room is. And all these lights suddenly show shadows on the wall. And these shadows are varying kinds of shades of dark to light. And they're very visibly looking like shadows of plants. You can also see wooden tube-like vessels hanging at random points in the ceiling. And slowly you start to hear the sound of what sounds like a flute. And you sit and listen to these sounds that move. I say move as in the sounds seem to come from differing directions, some to the left, some to the right of you, some above. And over time, I started to realize that these wooden tubes are actually flutes. And the differing light that you see hitting these, what are kind of plants, forced me to sort of sit up from where I was encouraged to sit on the floor. I put my head over the railing, and lo and behold, were all of these green plants. And I start to understand that what I'm seeing has a whole backstage to it that I can't, and I'm not sure if the artist wants me to see or not. Over time, you realize that there's a certain kind of melody playing, but I'm not sure if that melody is coming from the artist. Is it coming from the flute? Is it coming from somewhere else in between? And I think that's the wonder of this marvelous installation that actually has quite a complex technical setup to it, where what we're listening to is live recordings of winds, the wind gusts in Tam Dao, which is in northern Hanoi. And Trinh Thi, the artist, has set up a certain way to have these sounds of the wind feed directly into this space. And the wind is playing the flutes. And the velocity of the wind is what changes the light qualities of these sounds onto the plants, and thus offering varying shadow work onto the wall. One of the wonderful elements about this particular installation is that what we're seeing, rather, I should say, what we are listening to, is a historic narrative. Now, you might ask, but I just said it's live. But this particular setting, as in what I came to now understand, are actually chili plants. There is a whole other narrative to these chili plants that is deeply connected to Vietnam, deeply connected to a very, very specific history, and that history is not visible. It is not possible to discuss in Vietnam. So now I'd actually love to invite Nguyễn Trinh Thi to the Zoom room and ask her to share a little bit about the motivations for this piece, and indeed to share a little about this history that I'm discussing, that this work is about.
Thank you,
and
Zoe.
maybe you want to show the video documentation as you go, or you can show it first, whatever you like.
Maybe we show it first?
Yeah, that's a good idea.
So my turn.
Yep.
Okay. I have to apologize. This work, it's extremely difficult to document. It's kind of, it's a really experiential, and you just have to go there and being in that space and listen to the sound. Like, you know, you just cannot take the photos, and video also doesn't show how all these many layers of shadows kind of reveal themselves slowly, and the feeling of just like being small in the middle of the kind of dark universe, and hearing the many subtleties and the characters of each flute that is impossible to show through our usual like audiovisual way of documenting. So anyway, come back to Zoe's question. I feel in this work, there are so many influences and inspirations that I have gathered during the past 15 or more years, coming back to the very beginning of the time when I started to make film or artwork. And kind of in this work, I feel like all these influences came together, and I'm happy, you know, to be able to kind of connect all these elements together. So coming back to the time 15 years ago, or more, that was one of my very first project that I wanted to do, coming back to live in Vietnam. I wanted to document and learn about the generation of artists and writers, poets in Vietnam who lived in the 50s and 60s, and you know, you can describe them as dissident writers or artists. You know, a lot of time they were not like only political, but they very simply that they were demanding for their rights of, you know, artistic expression. So, you know, these kind of movements in Vietnam, we call it nhân văn giai phẩm, which means humanism and works of beauty. That is the names of the two publications that they managed to publish for a very short time. And the artists and writers belonging to these movements, they got suffered in the coming decades. I mean, partly because Vietnam like had to go through so many wars, and you know, the control of intellectuals during wartime is always terrible. But anyway, so this kind of phenomenon was very interesting to me, and I really wanted to learn about it, and especially to get to meet and know these artists in person. And I was very lucky. I feel completely privileged and very lucky to be able to know some of them. And so I documented some artists who still survive. And Bùi Ngọc Tấn, the writer who wrote Tale of the Year 2000 that I got the inspiration from for this work. He actually belonged to the next generation who live and work from the 60s. And he spent 5 years in prison, and or you call it detention camps, various ones in the northern Vietnam, in the mountain. So I got to talk to him many times when he was still alive. He has passed away a few years ago. And he later on in his life, after many years after prison, he couldn't write anything. But sometime later, he wrote about his experience living in the detention camps as a novel, but autobiographical novel. And I really love this book, and I wanted to do something with it or with him. And actually, we were talking about potentially revisiting the work in some way when I was already kind of having the interest in sound and listening. I did mention to him that, you know, can we revisit your book, but try to do something with the kind of sound memories of that time. And especially he worked a lot with other prisoners every day in the forest. And after he died, I reread the book and to see, you know, what I could do. And I was at that time I was extremely kind of attracted to the language that he talked about in terms of slangs that prisoners use that belong to a specific history and specific time, and also the kind of language that is maybe I can call like ecological or botanical language, because he describes the forest, the plants, the trees, the ecological system where he worked as a forced labor. And I really love this book because he didn't describe his time being in detention camp as a victim and you know, with like kind of pessimism or anything, but he actually spent the time to just kind of describe nature and plants and birds and birds songs and things like that. And yeah, so I feel like this is a source that would give me the potential to kind of unite my kind of various interests, and it's kind of like it offers like an overlapping of political history or political memories with ecological memories, and they offer like very different kind of maybe you can say like temporalities. It's also it's talk about a very specific time, but at the same time you feel like you can step out and you can look at everything in a much broader way. And yeah, and then at the same time I was very interested in sound and listening, and I was working with indigenous people for past few projects, from Letters from Panduranga with the Cham people and How to Improve the World with the Jarai people. And I was very inspired by the way they perceive the world through listening, and also the way they play music together. For the indigenous people, like in Central Highlands, the way they play flutes or gongs or other kind of instruments, they always have to play together. So if they want to play flutes, then they would have, for example, a set of 6 flutes, and each guy would just play one note. So you can never play music by playing alone, but you have to play as together. And you have to listen to each other, because, you know, if I just play myself and don't listen to other, then I cannot make the music together with other people. So that way was also kind of very inspiring for me, and this collective way of making music. And I was very interested in this particular scene in the novel of the Chile forest. It really spoke to me, and it kind of had all the elements that can help me to bring many elements together. Because in this scene, it's a very strange kind of surrealist scene of a huge ancient Chile forest that the prisoners one day they came across. And Bùi Ngọc Tần, he described that, you know, as a prisoner, he really, or other prisoners also, they really miss the taste of chili, because, you know, for Vietnamese people and other people in Southeast Asia, chili is very, very important. And in prison, if you don't have chili, then, you know, of course, that is like treasure. And for him, that's the taste of chili is a taste of freedom and the taste of home. So imagine how all these prisoners would, how crazy they would become when they see this chili forest, and they became unstoppable. And the security guards, they try everything, and nobody could stop them from picking and stuffing all the chilies into all their pockets. And so it ended with firing, you know, by the security guards. And first they just threatened, but at the end they really shot. And the prisoner who died, he was a Hmong guy, and so he's an indigenous minority person. So that also kind of connected to my interest, or my you know, area of working with like indigeneity and indigenous people. So I, you know, so with that inspiration of music played together, and also with this indigenous prisoners' death, I started to research and try to find the kind of music instruments that they play in northern Vietnam, for, you know, by the tribes that came from the area where he came from. And I thought about flute, because I just feel like flute is the sound of it. It's kind of like a breath, you know. It's breathing, and it's kind of it's this kind of like being able to connect, you know, different times and different kind of realms. Yeah, so I found the kind of flutes that they play, you know, by these indigenous people in the north. And so I was also kind of changing my approach and my interest in making work as well, because like previously I made a lot of films and moving image, and I was always struggle with the kind of restrictions or limitations of cinema, and of, you know, with especially with the issue of representation of the visual image or of the moving image. So I kind of, that's why I kind of wanted to use more of other kind of medium like sound, and the use of the space. And also I also wanted to bring in more elements like, you know, kind of like performativity, and I was researching, you know, the kind of mechanisms by which other kind of non-human being would maybe use to communicate. And I was more interested in using those elements, in using that kind of mechanism as a medium to, or as a way to build the work, or as a way to invite, you know, other kind of forces like natural forces or invisible forces, other kind of dimensions in the world to be, you know, kind of creating the work with me rather than trying to represent or trying to describe nature.
Yeah, I think that the power of your work for me, even your moving images, is the way that I come away realizing that I'm listening to the image rather than looking at it. And that's a slight differentiation in how we can relate to what we see typically as cinema. But in your narratives, I think we're struck by the fact that landscapes are witnesses. Landscapes are substances and consciousness that has seen so much. And there's a way that you have found in many of your moving images and installation works to give that presence to what I like to call polyphony, this idea that there is multiple ways to which we can recall, engage, and remember. And that sometimes for an artist, as you say, to struggle with representation, I took great joy in seeing this installation actually for the first time in Wales, because I felt this kind of release with the storytelling. And I think that there is something marvelous about this installation allowing the wind to be the author. And the fact that there's such a power in giving recognition to that force beyond the control of us as humans. So indeed, that installation at times will likely be a very quiet space because the wind is very quiet. And there's nothing that you can do to make that narrative fasten up or be more with, you know, sound and shadow. So on that note, in thinking about the power of sound and indeed almost the role of the found, I'd like Philippa to come to the room because I know that your own scholarship on key has very much centered, indeed still is in process with your work, looking at how sound features as prominent spaces for artists to recall certain contentious histories, but also those spaces of the non-human. So yeah. I don't know about, maybe you'd like to share a little bit about the current work and maybe Letters of Panduranga, which is also screening as part of Artist Mundi.
Sure. Okay. Well, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah. So just very quickly, just describe myself. So I'm a middle-aged woman, in my late 40s. I've got quite long blonde brown hair and a white woman, and I'm wearing glasses, and I'm sitting in my attic room, which is my office at work. So I have some books behind me, and it's quite chilly today in Scotland. So I have a scarf around me too. So yeah, I mean, thanks for that. And it's really great to hear T talking about her work, which is always incredibly interesting and rich, and so many different things that we can follow up in this conversation. So thank you to Artist Mundi for the invitation. It's great to be here. I suppose there's kind of three main aspects that I wanted to talk about in relation to sound and ecology in the work. And I think the first one, and maybe we can kind of use these as kind of jumping off points for a conversation, but I've kind of put together some thoughts, particularly firstly about the idea of performance and liveness, which is such an important part of this work. The second point is around sound and relationality. And the third point is about the idea of site responsive sound and moving image installation. So thinking about the relationship between sound and the space in which we experience it. So perhaps moving away from thinking about site-specific installations and thinking about a more kind of active process of kind of engagement through sound and through listening. So yeah, I thought that performance and liveness would be quite a good place to start. Thinking about the sonic aspects of this work in particular, because obviously it's really important, as T has really stressed, that the flute for people to understand that the flute sounds aren't recorded and played back, right? So we're not listening to playback. We're not listening to this kind of a recording that took place in a previous time in a previous place. But this is a piece of live theatre in which the non-human elements are performers in this piece and collaborators, as T talks about. So I wanted to kind of tie this into this idea of thinking about performance and liveness to T's idea of landscapes being quiet witnesses to history, which I think is such a really kind of important way of approaching her work, particularly the landscape series, that we can trace connections. And you mentioned Letters from Pandarangal. We can think about that in relation to that too. But actually, a book that I found really, really helpful that I wanted to mention, and if it's all right, just to kind of read out a very short quote from this book, which I think is incredibly helpful for thinking about some of these questions that we've been kind of talking about so far in relation to the question of history, place, landscape, but also liveness, and thinking specifically about the quality of sound, right? So the fact that sound is ephemeral, the fact that sound is always in movement, always transient, and how does that relate to an idea of history tied to a particular location and place? So Diana Taylor's book is The Archive and the Repertoire, and this is what I think is really interesting and useful for approaching ideas of performance, ephemerality, history, and witnessing, because of the ways that she considers how something that takes place in the here and now, so something that is absolutely happening, that we're all present with in this present moment, how this can give evidence of something that happened in the past. So I'll just read out this quote, which I think is really relevant for the conversation. She says, "Colonial history, with its logic of linearity, privileges unique, remarkable events. It strives for a definitive account of people and places through documents and documentation. This kind of history has not only foregrounded its own story with its own protagonists, it has also dispossessed those who could not prove their claims to lands, discoveries, or protagonism through deeds and titles. Performances," she says, "can tell a different story, one that is about people and place, but not in a linear sense. The past might be conceived not only as a timeline, accessed as a leap backwards and forward to the present again, but also as a multi-layered sedimentation, a form of vertical density rather than horizontal sweep, not an either or, but a both and." So Taylor's reference here that I think is interesting, think about ecologies and places and environments, her reference to sedimentation is really directly responding to the idea of the earth and a kind of geological approach to thinking about layered histories of time, in particular in relation to the ground. And what I think is really interesting about T's work is how she's actually thinking about this differently. Obviously, she's not referring directly to this work, but I think that she's approaching similar ideas, but not through the earth and the ground, but through the medium of air. And I think specifically the comment that she mentioned earlier about that relationship between air, the medium of air, and the breath is something that I'd really like to kind of invite us all to kind of reflect on and ask T about as well. But thinking about this kind of ecological perspective, maybe thinking about the idea of chi and thinking about breath as a life force that connects all living beings, and thinking again about this way in which T's work kind of approaches these kind of relational ontologies, if you like, in terms of the different ways that we are all interconnected within these stories. So when I was thinking about this idea in relation to T's work and the sonic and ecological aspects of this, I was really thinking about, again, kind of really thinking about the quality of sound. And I was thinking about how the kind of capaciousness of sound allows for the enfolding of these different layers of temporality, but also geographical kind of layers as well within the experience of being in that installation. And as T emphasized, it's really crucial to be in that space, to really be able to feel that experience of unfolding of different time periods and different geographical locations. And I think crucially, part of this unfolding is about this notion that Thi talks about is about embodied memory. And I think what I find interesting to think about there is that embodied memory is not just human embodied memory, but it's also non-human or more than human embodied memories as well. So the sonic is inherently ephemeral, as I said, and it's also fluid and mobile, and it can connect vast spaces. It can connect distances, right, across many kind of different locations. So it can connect spaces across vast different distances. But at the same time, as well as being this kind of vast potential in terms of a planetary scale, it's also fragile, it's also intimate, it's sensory, it's embodied. And in that way, you know, sound is able to kind of move across these different scales from the planetary to the very intimate experience of being in that space. And another kind of point that I wanted to ask everybody is about, and perhaps this is something that some of the audience members who've been to the installation can kind of talk about, of that experience, which I wouldn't want to necessarily kind of share my own experience in terms of like, this is the right way to experience it, because everybody's experience of the installation will be very different. So I wanted to think about the ways as well that thinking about this relationship between the intimate and the kind of sensory aspect is also the ways in which the flutes themselves are a kind of conduit. I think you mentioned this before in your introduction, Zoe, as well. They're a kind of channel that connects generational or intergenerational memories of listening, of playing, but also the craft and skill in terms of making those flutes themselves that has been developed over many, many years through sound and through listening. So the expansive concept of time that I think the work invites us to think about is both historical in the fact that it references back a kind of specific moments in time and certain events, but it's also cyclical. And I'm really thinking there about the kind of cyclical from a kind of ecological perspective, but also in that beautiful way that Thi described the practice of playing music that How to Improve the World is really kind of interested in. And I was thinking about the kind of circular configuration of the installation of How to Improve the World as it's been shown in a couple of places. So I wanted to just also briefly mention about how this kind of way of thinking about layers of sound relates to particular moments in the past. So it's thinking about the kind of frenzied reaction to the chilies that she describes in relation to the novel. It's about this particular instance of the shooting of the Indigenous prisoner, but also at the same time, it's about when the novel was published and immediately censored. But at the same time, it's also very much about the present, right? So it's also about ecological effects of processes like deforestation. It's about, potentially we could say that it's also about ongoing effects of censorship within Vietnam. So there's really interesting ways that I think that this idea of sound as being kind of enfolding all of these different layers of time is really, really beautifully and quite wonderfully kind of brought together in this installation. So I wanted to maybe think about this in terms of, and another question that I wanted to ask was about what this work then does. Is it also in reflecting on the past and the present? Is it also future orientated practice, right? So I was thinking about May's work writing about potentiality, and what does it mean then in terms of what Taylor talks about is reactivating the past through performance, and what that means for a kind of future orientated practice.
I think that mode of recall to question what kind of moment we're in right now, whether we're in the past or whether we're imagining the future, or even if we're imagining a whole other kind of spiritual dimension. Like there's this moment in the film, How to Improve the World, and the main character, or Sep, Thi asks him, what is your first memory? Is it image or sound? And he, without any hesitation, says sound. And he shares how he, as a shaman, was once visited by the spirits, and that relationship, it meant everything to him until the missionaries moved in, until the church hymns moved in, and the church hymns started to be played with the traditional instruments that once would speak to him, to his spirits. And so you see T in her film work too, using sound, even as concept, is alluding to another spiritual dimension out there that, according to colonialism, they will like to say that the indigenous are the past. But what she also says in Letters to Panduranga, she points out that the Cham are indeed still alive, even if the UN wants to classify their cemeteries and their large shrine houses of spirit respect as heritage. There's this wonderful way that T in her work manages to contrast so many different kinds of temporalities, as she said. And I think that there is this very powerful potentiality, as you say. And indeed, May and her writing and her research has definitely spoken about how the Southeast Asian body of work that is being done by many contemporary artists is engaging how this other, how the moving image can embrace what we might call the animistic gesture, this understanding that there are a whole other kind of narratives and meanings and values out there that we are not paying attention to because we're so stuck on this question of sight. And indeed, there's that next question that P asks her daughter in How to Improve the World. She asks her daughter the exact same question. What is your first memory, an image or sound? And she says, image. And we see a whole contrast of time and generational relation to reality taking place. So maybe at this point, I don't know if T wants to comment on something that Philippa has said. If not, then I can invite May to the room to share a little bit about her own reference to T and what role she sees the moving image particularly playing in T's art. You have anything you want to say, T? Oh, your mic is off.
Sorry, I was just saying that I would prefer to listen to May without.
Okay, all right. Over to May.
Thank you, Zoe and T and Philippa. Hi, everyone. My name is May Adadol Ingawanij. I'm sitting in my study at home in the south of the UK, in Buckinghamshire, against a colourful background. I'm a middle-aged mother. I wear glasses, and my glasses, one side is blue and one side is orange. I'm very happy about this pair of glasses. So I think let's do it this way, and let's see if I can.
Like I was wondering, May, whether or not you expressed any kind of surprise at seeing this installation come from P, considering that her main practice has been so deeply committed to image making, and to whether or not you can see a conversation that is continuing with her exploration of space in the same way that she explores space in images. So I find that is actually also quite a beautiful kind of relationship she's building, where she's taking us on to this next sensorial level of narrative and knowledge building.
I think overall I actually sense continuity rather than a moving into a more sort of immersive, a more sound-based kind of practice as a way of abandoning or problematizing the image. And I think the continuity that I see here is to do with the way that the ethics of T's practice is about attentive listening and looking. So I think rather than maybe stray into thinking about image versus sound, I think the continuity here is attentiveness. And I want to maybe go back to the rather beautiful point that T made about what she wants people to sort of experience in relation to this installation. And T said something like, the experience that she wants is for us all to have this feeling of being small in the middle of a dark universe. And my absolute fascination with T's work has to do with, I think, this quality of making moving image work, more recently making sort of sound-based installation work as relational in the sense of the sort of connections that can be established between people or between people and other forms of living being in this more animistic or cosmological sense of being small, being vulnerable in a vast universe. And I think then we can sort of link this point back to, you know, Philippa's beautiful prompt as well about the role that sound plays in creating a sort of intimacy of experience. And I think that the shared quality of that experience that's coming across here is that T's practice is exemplary of the kind of relational practice that we are seeing in much of contemporary art, certainly in a lot of Southeast Asian contemporary art. It's a kind of practice that celebrates and that desires relations and connections as that which enriches our state of being in the world as small and vulnerable peoples and beings. I want to branch off from that into how we might think about the relational with T's work. The question of the ecological dimension of relations, I think maybe is a little bit more explicit at the moment in relation to the later work. So I'm totally fascinated that in the installation and in the way that T introduces the installation, the question of the political memory, political relations, political history is so intertwined with a kind of ecological ethics. I think that's absolutely fascinating and very, very important to bear in mind. I myself, in my effort to write about T's work, in my effort to be creative with the language of artist moving image as animistic, I'm very interested in the way that that enables us to think of artists, contemporary artistic practices and moving image practices as relational in the sense of establishing intergenerational relations. And here, therefore, when T tells us a little bit about her research and her motivation for this work, the tacit layering of this work, the inspiration to connect and to recuperate something of the work, the aspirations and the experiences of the previous generations of Vietnamese artists, I think is really, really important to pause over, to think about and to talk about a little bit more. And maybe the last point that I want to propose, and this is possibly something that comes through maybe a little bit more when I think about the earlier phase of T's work and the way that T makes sort of found footage work. And I think that has to do with thinking about relations as relations across differences. So that I think we see this in works like How to Improve the World, and certainly in Letters from Panduranga, where those works are encouraging us to think through is the way that artistic practice in the context in the historical context that Thi is working in and in the present time of Vietnam, is a kind of artistic practice which also entails the ethics and the aesthetics of encountering society's minorities and all the dilemmas that come with that. And I think this is an artistic speaking position that remains very much relevant, that remains very much a dilemma. And so when talking about the sort of shift towards artistic practice as being a practice that's very preoccupied with the question of relations, with the question of human non-human relationships, the layers of complexity that I think remains consistent in Thi's work, I think still revolves around this question of the ethics and the conundrum of artistic encounter as an encounter which entails actually going out, leaving the city, going up to the Central Highlands in Vietnam, and encountering and trying to establish relations with society's minorities. So I think the way that Thi reminds us not to forget that there is an effort to make relations through the work and through the process of the work. And there is also an effort not to deny that there is difference, that there are power relations continually at play. I think that's very, very important to think about and to continue to think about.
Absolutely. And I think that the fact that Thi's journey in creative thinking began in journalism and international relations. And with that sort of a background to image making, to research, to the importance of historical memory, to understanding political agency. I mean, I think there's one of her, sorry, Thi, to talk about you like you're not in the room because you are here, but one of your early works called Landscape, where there's a series of postcards and you see these repetitive images and people pointing into landscapes, and there's not really anything that they're pointing at of any seeming description. And you realize that these repetitive images are what we see in Vietnamese newspapers. So it's a common ailment of Vietnam, where someone will say an atrocity took place, evidence will be removed, a journalist will arrive, and there's nothing left to see. So there's a certain kind of basis to perhaps to Thi's worlding that comes from a questioning of certain kinds of sciences. And maybe Thi, you want to come back into this little Zoom room with us, and maybe I'll ask Philippa to turn her video on also with us now for a little bit of a sort of a group sort of chat to wrap up, further ask each other's questions, so to speak, because I think there's some really interesting gestures being said about your practice, Thi, and thinking about how you touch on what is tangible and what is intangible, and that there's these memories of, as May says, that are intergenerational that you're trying to give testimony to. So I was wondering whether you had any general feedback at all to what Philippa and May are saying about your practice, and whether you, I mean, maybe you disagree with something that we've said.
No, I thank you so much, Philippa and May, for your wonderful and generous analysis of my work from different kind of angles. Actually, I really wanted to say right from the beginning, but I forgot, because I mentioned that in this work, I feel like I had worked with so many sources of inspiration. And actually, one of those would be that coming from May's practice and May's work with animistic practices in Thailand and in Southeast Asia, and in moving image in Thailand, and the many conversations that we had about this, so I feel like maybe I'm not animistic myself, but I'm very interested, and I'm kind of like wanted to. I feel like everything is possible, and I want to kind of acknowledge that in this world there are many other worlds that are possible, and we are all connected together, and we are all equal. The different worlds between different people, and also the different worlds between the human and the non-human beings. And I thought about the something that May mentioned before about the practice of Lav Diaz, for example, and he was saying that he was making the movies maybe not just for human beings.
I didn't catch that name. Could you say that name again, please? Sorry, I just missed that. The interpreter, thank you.
Lav Diaz. Yeah, so I was I think in a way I was I'm trying to I'm thinking that I'm kind of trying to collaborate with other forces and invite them to speak and to make the work or to compose. And also I would like to think that I'm making this work for you human beings, but it can be also there for other beings that can be non-human. Yeah, so thank you, May, for your inspiration.
That's really beautiful that you brought up the work of Filipino filmmaker Lav Diaz, because your work and Lav's work stay with me very, very much, and particularly they really make me think about what does it mean to be an engaged artist in contemporary Southeast Asia right now, because when we think about Southeast Asian artistic practice historically, the model of being an engaged artist has such a long and strong tradition, but maybe historically during much of the 20th century, anti-colonial struggles, wartime in Indochina, that model has tended to be a very sort of masculinist, avant-garde, the artist as society's revolutionaries, that kind of model. So I'm particularly intrigued in your work and in Lav Diaz's work as well, in the way that your practice seemed both to, it's back to this question of intergenerational relations, not both wanting to remain committed to the idea of the artist as one who is socially engaged. So the engaged artist, the artist in a specific society. Very strikingly, in the catalogue of Artist Mundi exhibition, I noticed that in your biography you say born in Hanoi, continues to live and work in Vietnam. I think that's a very that's something to think about. And yet at the same time, your artistic practice, the way that it embraces and it aestheticizes different layers and levels and time frames of the relational, seems to me to also be a move away from the sort of historical regional model that we have of being the engaged artist. And I think Lav Diaz does it in his own way as well. So maybe I want to kind of come back to this question of, for you, what is it to be an engaged artist in the here and now? And maybe open this question to Zoe as someone, you know, who's got loads of experience of working curatorially with artists, and then also to Philippa as someone who thinks very, very hard and very deeply about question of ecology, the role of sound, you know, in relation to contemporary Southeast Asian artists' moving image practices. I think actually haunting all the questions that we ask is this question of what does it mean to be an engaged artist in Southeast Asia now?
Yes. And I think that it is, for those in the room who may not know, Vietnam is a very beautiful place, but it has a huge amount of political restriction on the ability to be honest. And that means that there's an alarming amount of censorship in Vietnam. Many people may not know that the landscape there can be quite catastrophically claustrophobic. And it is in huge testament to the artists who continue to ply the past that they commit themselves to being engaged, because there is a level of risk and there is a certain level of conscience that has to go into committing ourselves to narratives that are not permitted to be engaged on an official level. I think, yeah, I mean, T, you should go first to answer. May, how do you see yourself as being engaged as an artist in Southeast Asia?
It's such a difficult question, May, but I thought about this, and I think that I kind of struggle with it. With letters from Panduranga, I remember that I usually use this line to describe my thinking at that point. And a lot of that I was trying to answer with the film. And in that line, I was saying something like, as an artist, I feel like I'm constantly kind of facing this dilemma between feeling like I want to engage or being engaged, and wanting to just disappear. And I think for artists, I can speak just for myself, but I think that is maybe kind of like the two poems that's kind of, you know, pulling the artist to two sides. On the one side, you are concerned and you think of all these kind of issues and problems around you. As a citizen, as playing every kind of role in society. But on the other hand, I feel like as an artist, sometimes you just you just really want to disappear, and you just want to not having anything to do with those things. So how do you solve that problem? I guess one of the way that I thought before that I was kind of using to, or helping me to a bit kind of get away with that, was that I was kind of playing the role of an kind of an activist or educationist.
Yeah.
By running Doglet. Hanoi Doglet is the center. So in that way, I could, you know, do things as more as a activist by, you know, kind of like training or, you know, try to guide people in certain ways or something, and maybe building a kind of more explicit kind of discourse for the art or the kind of independent filmmaking. And then I feel like, okay, then I can fill this role, and I have done my part as a kind of activist. And then so now I can be left alone to do my small experimentation. You know, I can do like tiny work, and that doesn't try to solve any problem. Yeah, and I was thinking that and also, like, you know, with letters from Panduranga, for example, because I was talking about quite big issues, you know, like things with you know, construction of nuclear power plants, and you know, survival of a whole civilization or people, and many kind of quite big issues. But I did it not with a perspective that I could really solve any problem, or I could really help really kind of change the you know, any kind of real thing in the world. But I was happy enough to find from among the audience, if some people, especially if they are also filmmakers or artists, if they told me that your film really inspired me, then that was like more than enough for me. And I think the engagement of artists are very difficult to measure. You know, it's very difficult. So I can only just live and continue to be curious about the external world, and continue to have a conversation and be open up with, I think, people and everything, and just try to do my best to, I really want to create like beautiful works. I don't know.
I think you do. I think you do.
You very much have done that. And I think it's just thinking through what you say, it's not at all the case that we can describe what you're doing as any kind of a retreating, because I think it's so important for you to be folding your thinking about these dilemmas of what it is to be responsible and engaged as an artist into the form of your very works. And I think we can also see this consistently in the later works, that gesture of saying, I am an engaged artist, but I am not going to be claiming the kind of historical prerogative that maybe previous generations of masculine artists have claimed about, you know, being society's leader. That in itself is a very, very provocative gesture. And it feeds, I think, directly into the sort of, you know, the aesthetic sensibility that we're seeing. I'm dying to see this installation, but I'm also sensing, you know, the sort of intimacy of that work that Philippa talks about.
And there shouldn't be any underestimation also of the influence Hanoi Doc Lab and your own guidance or just mere mentorship of young filmmakers has had on other Vietnamese filmmakers today. I think that needs to also be really re-emphasized, that you've got a certain way of guiding that isn't telling others what to do, but really just sitting there and actually just listening, which is actually a really strong part of your practice. Yeah.
So maybe I want to return to the question that Philippa raised about futurism. I'm really, really interested in thinking about artistic futurism differently. And I wonder, with Thi's work, particularly with maybe the sonic registers and the aesthetics of intimacy of Thi's work, can we think about how this is a kind of Southeast Asian futurism? That's not like the futurism that, you know, we have very cliched image of what Asian futurist art is. I think it's very important to create a new conversation about what futurism we want.
Absolutely. Philippa, do you have anything you want to say in response to May's question about engaged or Asian futurism, what it looks like for you? Oh, you're on mute.
I can try really quickly, but I'm also conscious of questions from the audience.
Yes, we have one.
So, okay, so in terms of, well, I suppose what I'd say kind of in terms of listening practices, in the context of Southeast Asian artists and filmmakers, you know, on the surface, you have a very surface level kind of silencing that occurs as a result of censorship. But that's on the surface, and I think that what you see in artists like Thi is a kind of active, it's a mode of attunement that is about listening beneath that surface, and I think that in terms of thinking of this as a kind of counter listening, and that's something that Garcia Uzunian has written about, who's a really brilliant sound theorist, is this kind of process of listening against that dominant narrative, which is a kind of process of silencing. So I think there's lots of ways in which we can think about that from an ecological perspective. If you bring in people like, you know, Anna Singh's ideas around polyphony that you mentioned earlier at the beginning, in terms of futurism, that would be a brilliant conversation for the future.
Thi, we have a question from the room. And it goes, Tam Dao is a real life location, has been going through massive changes in terms of the urbanization and destruction of its forests. Its future, as one of the protagonists of your work, is inevitably at risk. The livelihood of your work, in turn, at some point will no longer be in yours or anyone's hand. When the work is no longer able to voice its story, or the story you're trying to convey to and provoke in us, be it political, ecological, historical, are you concerned that it may then lose its meaning? How else can we continue to engage with an entity that might be made muted, which in many ways can be seen as an extension, whether desired or by accident, of the silenced, marginalized, contextual origin that guided the making of this work in the first place?
Wow.
Wow. Are you concerned that it may lose its meaning?
No, I'm not. I feel like this work or any other kind of work, I don't think about the kind of course I would love for the work to live forever and making impacts and stuff like that and inspire. But I don't really think about that. I feel like as artists, when you make work, you just, it's not different than like a poet making a poem, and that was just coming out of you at the moment. And if it's good, it would live on, and many people in the future generations would hopefully still read your poem and would still feel something. And yeah, so I think that I would think about my work. I would love to think about my work in that way, that it exists as a poem, as a poem. And I don't know, it's already out there in the world, and once it's out there, it doesn't belong to me anymore, and it belongs to the audience and to the people who see it. And actually, in this kind of work, the active role of the audience is very important. You really have to live with it, and you feel something or you think something. It's beyond my control. I try to create an environment for you to live, to be in. And actually, I really love something that a friend of mine who came to see the work in Kassel, when she came out, and she told me that you turns the audience into an instrument. And that's I think it's beautiful.
Absolutely. And I think there is an element to, for me at least, in many of your pieces, this beautiful way of talking about transience, to talk about dispossession, and to think of things as beautiful in their fleetingness, whether or not it's the way you treat light, or whether you're thinking about how narratives can never be singular. There's always this sense that there's something beyond the control. And your answer just then to say, I don't want to have to think about my work as being controlled by one, or that it considers a fragment somewhere, and that a poem can be existing in that way. I think that's a really beautiful way to think about how perhaps we should be looking at the human's impact on the planet, that we need to better understand that we are fleeting, and so we need to respect the moments that we exist in the world. It's 9:22 for us here in Vietnam and Thailand. I'm aware that we've got maybe 5 minutes left in the room. If anyone out there has a burgeoning question that they want to ask T in the final moments, please do. But it's been great to have this little time with May and Philippa and P talking about a practice that really, to me, is incredibly important in the world. But I must say that I have a lot of respect for it, particularly in Southeast Asia, and what you've done for thinking about women filmmakers, for thinking and questioning what it means to represent, for giving the voice to the non-human in thinking about what it means to be Indigenous with our visions. I think that these are conversations that we really very much need to be having in the world, particularly where we are living.
I think somebody has their hand up in the attendees list. Vando?
Oh, I can't see anyone's hand from where I'm sitting.
There.
Oh, that's rather unfortunate. I can't see a hand from my screen. Maybe someone at Artist Mundi can see.
The hand has now been lowered, sorry.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, I think I wish I could show more of the film works to be able to finish the session that we have here. I feel like if anyone hasn't had a chance to see T's film works, you can visit Chapter, where you will see Vietnam, the movie, and Letters from Panduranga. But also T's website itself also has some really good short snippets of some of her work. And I do urge that you will pay that a visit.
Thank you, Zoe. I'm really struck that this is the first of the 7 conversations with the 7 artists we're working with AM10, and how smartly all contributors, T, Zoe, May, and Philippa have opened up a conversation which, as can often be the case, could certainly run for many more minutes to come. One of the core mission statements for Artist Mundi is that we seek to stimulate dialogue, and through that gain understanding not only of ourselves but of others, and from familiar and non-familiar cultures. And certainly the conversation today, to my mind, has really opened up a whole series of possibilities that map directly against that. So thank you all. I'm lucky enough to have experienced the installation both in Kassel in Germany and in Swansea, and while 2 very different environments that the work was presented in, which of course lend other layers to your experience of the work. At its core, the really rather sort of powerful and poignant evocation of ideas and thoughts that transcend across time, space, and histories, I think is very, very sort of clearly evoked in how you have a very tangible response to the work. And I'm struck by the idea of this idea of listening to a work in both a literal sense or a figurative sense, but also in a metaphorical way, in the way that visuals and combinations of visuals, physical experiences within an art work itself can speak to us about many things simultaneously. And certainly that seems to be very much embodied within and they die a natural death. So thank you again to the panelists, Zoe for sort of moderating and leading the conversation, to May and Philippa for your contributions, and certainly for T, it should go without saying, for what you've brought to the table today. As Zoe mentioned, as well as the installation at Glenvivian, there are 2 screening events forthcoming, so do keep your eye on our website for those. The first one will be in the cinema at Chapter in Cardiff, and then another screening event, maybe with slightly different content, of a selection of T's films at Glenvivian. The next talk in this series will be on the 16th of November at 7 p.m. Greenwich Mean Time, and that will take place with the panel involving Alia Farid, whose work is presented at National Museum Cardiff. In the chat, you will see a link to a survey, so please do take some time out there in audience world to complete, to fill that in and give us some responses to how hopefully you have enjoyed and found it today's conversation very enriching and rewarding. Other than that, I think thanks again to everybody. Thanks to you for attending, wherever you're viewing and listening to from across the world. And thanks again to everyone behind the scenes, Letty and Jane, who've been keeping things flowing pretty damn seamlessly, I'd say. So thanks to everyone involved, to you as our audience, and again, thanks to our panelists, and hope to feel your presence with us again for the second of these At the Table talks with Alia Farid on the 16th of November. Bye-bye.
Thank you.